this is the eve of the feast of Saint Hilary. He was not raised. He was born around 310 A.D. And he became a Christian probably when he was around 35 years old. He was married. He and his child and his wife, I believe, all were baptized at the same time. And eventually he became Bishop of Poitiers. He is known as the Hammer of the Arians because, of course, this was the great Christological controversies. And it's interesting to me when reflecting on his life, how much these heresies, these mistaken ideas recur. The Christ of the Arians was not that dissimilar from the Christ of Thomas Jefferson. And the fact that we understand that this is a mistake to see Christ as only Jesus, a human being specially favored by the Father, is due to a lot of the work of Saint Hilary. First, it's due to the grace of God, but through Saint Hilary's work. And he reflected a great deal on the meaning of the body, and also on the meaning of, he relied a great deal on the simplicity of Jesus's command to baptize us in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And implicit in that recognition of this first sacrament that Christ commands us to do is the reality of the Trinity, that all the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are all God and all co-equal with one another. And the way this could be remains a mystery. But if it's not true, then I think, this is me, not Saint Hilary, then Jesus was not a great philosopher. He was somewhat deluded because he kept in various ways insisting on this great truth. I want to read, I can do it on my phone, something that Pope Benedict reflected on Saint Hilary in his general audience of October 10th, 2007. I put the link in the chat box, or if you just Google Saint Hilary of Poitiers, Pope Benedict the 16th, it comes right up. So, it's also interesting that he took part in the south of France in what he called the Synod of the False Apostles, because this synod was dominated by Arians who believed Jesus Christ was only a favored son, but not truly a part of the Godhood. And he argued so forcefully that the bishops of the Synod of the False Apostles all got together and went to the emperor and insisted that he banish Saint Hilary to Turkey. So he had to go out from the south of France, what we call France, what they called Gaul. And he lived for, I think, about 10 years in Turkey, surrounded by Arians. And his response to this was not to take pity on himself, but to redouble his efforts to preach and teach about the divinity of Jesus Christ. And I have been reading, I never did before, but I've been reading his very influential book on the Trinity. It's called in English. And I think it's very interesting because he combines a very sophisticated philosophical account with reliance on the scriptures, with his own personal journey, motivated by the belief that it can't be true that this beauty of this world and the beauty of our existence, the final answer to that is death. And Pope Benedict said about him, let's see, there's a beautiful quote that Pope Benedict wanted to say about it. I find particularly beautiful the following formula of Saint Hilary, Pope Benedict said. God knows not how to be anything other than love. He knows not how to be anyone other than the Father. Those who love are not envious, and the one who is the Father is so in his totality. This name admits no compromise, as if God were Father in some aspects and not in others. Pope Benedict goes on to say, for this reason, the Son is fully God, without any gaps or diminishment. Quote, St. Hilary, the one who comes from the perfect is perfect because he has all, he has given all. Humanity found salvation in Christ alone, Son of God and Son of Man. In assuming our human nature, he has united himself with every man. He has become the flesh of us all. He took on himself the nature of all flesh, and through it became true life. He has in himself the root of every vine shoot. I thought this was appropriate for our conversation today because, our bodies are a gift from God. We're body and soul, as the Archbishop has reminded us on many occasions. And it is through the body we experience many delights, but also a great deal of suffering. And I was very struck in James Matthew Wilson's work of the revival of the great mystery of finding both in the everyday, in the body, and even in a time of suffering, the beauty and the mysteries of God himself. James, maybe you could take it from here and tell us a little bit about, maybe we could start by asking you about this title, The Strangeness of the Good.
Sure. Let me start just by thanking you, Maggie, and thank you, Archbishop Cordileone, first of all, for your trust in me and appointing me the poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute. It's been, though that obviously only happened after the beginnings of quarantine, in several ways, my association with you has been extremely fruitful, and I'm very grateful for it. And thanks to everybody for coming tonight. One of the reasons that this little event is on the books is because it's a real pain for an author to write a book and then to publish it and not to be able to share it with anybody. And I think I'm personally especially dependent on giving readings so that the words that are printed on the page maintain their connection with the live voice and with human speech. And so you all joining tonight and giving me a chance to share this work with you is something for which I'm also very grateful. So the strangeness of the good. I want to share a poem from which that phrase comes, but it seems to me that we live in an age of sentimentality and have for a long time. And it's easy for us, as it's easy for a cow or for anyone, to identify feelings with goodness. But the strangeness of the good is that it often stands athwart our feelings, and in fact requires discernment and penetration and patience. I don't want to pretend I'm offering a genuine hermeneutic of the first creation story of Genesis here, but I think there's something that God is trying to show us in the words of Genesis when God creates things and then sees that they're very good, as if they had to become objects of his contemplation for us to really discern the goodness within them. And it's that act of staring, to use kind of cliche words, paying attention, that is a prerequisite for seeing things as they really are, that was at least the tip of the iceberg of the theme I wanted to explore in this book. Now, shall I share a poem? I thought I'd begin with the poem Through the Water, which is the poem from which the title of the book comes. I mentioned at the outset that the fruitfulness of my association with the Benedict XVI Institute, and in fact, I'd like to sort of expand on that and go so far as to say that one of the real joys of the last several years has been not entirely relying on my own ingenuity when I'm trying to think of a poem to write about. I've been very grateful for the commissions to write poems that I've received in the last few years, including, above all, to write The River of the Immaculate Conception for the Benedict XVI Institute. One of the reasons is that because then you don't have to come up with an idea, and it's really a blessed relief not to have to start from scratch. So a magazine for the Archdiocese of New York asked me for a series of poems a year or so ago. The first one they asked for, I think, was on baptism. And baptism in itself is, of course, a very great mystery. But when we contemplate what's occurring, that going down into the depths to die and be reborn, I think in Benedict XVI's Jesus of Nazareth, in the early chapters, he has a great meditation on the nature of that baptism. And I think, in fact, it was in reading that book many years ago, I was reminded of one of my favorite passages from the California writer who's one of my favorite poets, Ivor Winters. And he says, this is in a note to one of his own poems, he says, he, as in human beings, must in some way cross or dive under the water, which is the most ancient symbol of the barrier between two worlds. And I thought of that and the barrier of baptism and the separation between two lives. And one night I thought of that other kind of diving in, which is one that, if you're looking for an example of it, you would find in the 10th book of Augustine's Confessions, where he dives into, not into the pool or the baptismal waters, but into the mansion of his thought, the palace of memory that he describes the human memory as being. Something that he pays considerable attention to, in part, but not only, because memory is one of the three faculties or features of our soul that Augustine likens to a person of the Trinity. So without any more of that, finally we'll turn to a poem, Through the Water. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers and a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, we will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden grove. In summer, pass within a stand of pines, cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in and our skies darken, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorn stray tufts of hair, a skull stripped of its hood, then turn and look down through the thickening ice in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where behemoth stalked in darkest depths that sank and sank as if there were no floor. He cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power, until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through, we're dead, but have returned, and are a new creation come to flower.
Wow. Thank you, James. I want to tell the audience that if you have comments or questions or would like to engage with James, you can do so by submitting questions in the chat box. I also wondered, Archbishop, this idea of baptism as the lintel between two worlds, does that resonate with you at all? Oh, you're wait a minute, Archbishop.
I realized I muted myself. Yes, there is the fathers speak about this too, St. Augustine, that there's a moment of a death that occurs at the same time of a new life, when they're, as in ancient times, they were immersed under the water. That immersion, their eyes are closed in imitation of death. They have to, when they're buried under the water, but that's the same moment at which a new life begins. So it's that the lintel, and I like that image for that moment of the death and the same moment that the new life begins.
Thank you, Archbishop. James, did you want to, how do you experience that in your life? Is this something that, anyway, I don't know that you know, poetry is this, you're a poet who really seems to me, at least, one of your gifts is to take that everydayness, the mundaneness, the reality of the physical, and see it lit up in some ways with the mystery. And there's something very characteristically Catholic about that. But
so I have to jump in, Maggie, because when I was reading this poem aloud to you, two of this, I see some people have the book. Tamara, I see, thank you. So it's on page 15 if anybody wants to look at. But as I was reading this aloud, one of the joys of reading the poem is two of the stanzas take place on my my family's vineyard estate. My in-laws are winemakers in Michigan, not in California, but and we go spend, both in summer and wintertime, spend a fair amount of time tramping around the acres of that farm, and with the kids. And if you remember what you do when you're out in the wilderness as a child, you're always exploring and looking for that strange thing that will suddenly catch your eye, and you'll fixate upon it, and it will feel as if the world just opens up in mystery. So I mentioned two familiar examples. These are things that actually happen with the children, but happened to me many times in childhood, where you suddenly discover a grove and you realize that as you've stepped through the trees, you've gone into a different world. And of course, if you love C.S. Lewis as I do, you know that sometimes you're stepping truly into a different world when you think you're in a wardrobe. And similarly, in the wintertime, we took a path that you can't take in the summer because it's too overcovered with growth. But in the wintertime, when the tall grass has been withered back a bit, we were able to find our way, and then we came across the spread fur of a deer that had clearly been run down and devoured by coyotes, and there was just one hoof and a leg and a skull. And it's moments like those that actually, I think, they're unusual, but they remind us of the everyday, or rather the significance of the everyday, which is that just these objects that suddenly catch us and stir us remind us that everything is sort of shot through with a kind of mystery, and that it's kind of the duty of childhood to train yourself to go exploring groves and looking for deer bones in the wilderness, precisely so that you learn how to see things as they are.
do you think, and this is maybe a romantic notion, not particularly a Catholic one, but it does seem like children are more open to this sudden stab of mystery than that, and maybe it's just that they don't yet know what the meaning of everyday objects are, so the possibilities seem more endless.
There is something that's very romantic, and C.S. Lewis, in his hands, it's kind of romantic. It comes out of English Romanticism, C.S. Lewis's thinking. I've kind of considered it my duty to kind of correct it and draw it back into just a richer Christian metaphysics of thinking about being and seeing the way things are, signs are enfolded within each other in the things of this world. And that really ends up being the theme of this entire book, learning to to see things wrapped inside one another.
Well, yeah, it's you take it to a very high level of sophistication where a lot in simple language that's just very packed with meaning. But I mean, somebody, I don't remember who, said we all have to become like children if we want to enter the kingdom of God too. So these things can always be corrupted in a direction, but I do think most of us can remember that sense of the world as full of the possibility of enchantment. And I think both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were somewhat dedicated to saying, yes, that is really the way the world is. We just lose sight of that mystery. But not when I'm hearing you read a poem, James. So maybe you should move on to the next one.
So
again, if anyone has comments or questions, feel free to add them to the chat, but let's enjoy this one.
In fact, the figure who most distills this for me is the Catholic, perhaps Catholic apostate James Joyce, whose first novel, the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, remains just one of my favorite books. And in the portrait, two things happen that I think I need to share before I read the next poem. One is that one of the things that Joyce in all of his work suggests is the way in which the mundane of walking through the city of Dublin, walking through any kind of space, that the materiality of things bear ghosts, spirits, significance within themselves, such that at any moment your past could confront you, in an object of a street vendor. That association that the young Stephen Dedalus makes between the things he sees in his daily walk to school in Dublin as a college student and the beautiful words of the silver vein prose of Cardinal Newman, as he puts it, the songs of Ben Jonson. That's always resonated with me, first of all, because I think it's beautiful the way he talks about it, but second of all, because it feels very close to how I sort of live in the world, where there's a dialogue going on at all times between what I'm seeing and what I'm remembering, and things are forming new wholes out of their little fragmentary selves. In the portrait, in the middle of the book, Stephen becomes very devout. He's converted in a profound way. And every day of his life is consecrated to a different prayer. And in fact, it's the same prayers that much of the church, including in our family, when we use our little children's prayer book each morning before breakfast, Tuesdays dedicated to your guardian angels, Wednesday to St. Joseph, and so on and so forth. He does all those things. And I always, whenever I teach this book to my students, I say, look how much better his life is than yours. For you, your feast days are Friday, where you say, thank God it's Friday. And then on Monday, you sigh, Mondays. That's the death of the soul. For him, every day is riven with significance, so that Wednesday is to St. Joseph, etc. So I was, one day I was so moved by that I just put at the top of a sheet of paper a line from the beginning of part 3 of Portrait of the Artist. Every morning he hallowed himself. And then I started writing, and of course, it was easy to write this poem because for years I lived in Dublin in the summers and would walk the same path that Stephen did to Newman House, what's now called Newman House, where Cardinal Newman started the Catholic University of Ireland, where the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins graded Latin exams, and where young James Joyce was a college student. So here's my tramp through from Grafton Street across Stephen's Green down to Newman House. While still a student, wandering abroad, but lodged in Dublin for a long July, I'd pass each day through King Street with a sigh, dismissing all I couldn't afford as fraud. I'd reach the busy end of Grafton Street and join its hosts of tourists on their way beneath the Fusler's Arch in fanned retreat into the green beyond, and there delay before bronze statues set along the path to figures those who'd felt the empire's wrath. My daily route would bridge the small lake's heart and come out just beside the bust of Joyce, where we would listen to that clamorous voice which formed a sentence from each place and part. The vulgar hawking wares, the verdant growth surrounding those immortalized in loss, and who spoke only through a die-cast oath that made on history's text a marginal gloss. The narrow gate, where branching birch and lime gave shade like Marvell's garden out of time. And then, before the stoop-browed church of brick that Newman built, scrunched in between a pair of Georgian homes, I'd silence thought for prayer and leave behind the mind's desultory tick. Stray images from Mahon, lines from Yeats, some thought of Maritons I couldn't decide the sense of. These were left with other freights, the future's dark or past wounds to my pride, as if they dropped within the postbox there before I'd mount the lion-sentried stair. Once in the college's marmoreal cool, I'd take the narrow staircase at the rear, where Hopkins muttered once in self-sunk drear, where Joyce had tramped with martyr, crank, and fool, and Newman raised his cassock round the knee to climb as I did, marking each flight's turn with prayer before each statue that he'd see. The mind's lit incense pausing there to burn for Joseph, Mary, and at last the Lord, that soul and body rise with one accord. How callow it must seem, that first attempt to measure out my days as if they were some liturgy whose borrowed form might moor a life adrift, misshapen and unkempt. We pass so absently from phase to phase, I know, that conscious disciplines seem vain. But even now, it sets my heart ablaze to see that young man bow to foreign reign. With him, I, older and unruly still, would have my will reordered by his will.
That is really rich. I have a small question. I wish I could say something that would rise to this occasion, James. Gave shade like Marvel's garden out of time. Is that a reference to Andrew Marvel?
Yes. Yeah, green. There's the most famous line of Marvel's The Garden is a green thought and a green shade.
Ah, all right.
So
yeah.
And of course,
I'm afraid that to his mistress, is to his coy mistress is the Marvel poem I most remember.
Yeah, this one's Taster.
Time's winged chariot hurrying near. I've got a comment. Thank you for that background. Very helpful in understanding the poem as you read it. Archbishop, did that bring up anything that you'd like to comment on from your school days or else?
Well, I think it harkens back to what a period of genius that was in English literature in those decades around the previous turn of the century. It was a real flourishing of genius. And I recall when we were first talking about the mission of the Institute, that was one of your inspirations about reclaiming the Catholic place in literary genius. And you were lamenting how few Catholic authors there are known in the world now. The ones that are people name are all deceased. So it was a real flourishing, and I appreciate your vision of wanting to reclaim that and the church reasserting her place with the Catholic imagination in the world of literature.
Well, thank you, Archbishop, for everything that you made possible. But I just think that James's work makes it clear that and other people's as well, that there is a real literary flourishing going on. What is somewhat different is that we live in a time that tends to value the accomplishment of reaching the masses, and that can be very significant. But then I just think about the fact, and I think I mentioned this on our artists retreat last time, that the John Donne, who I consider one of the great, if not the greatest poet of all time, never published a single poem during his life. He wrote poems for his friends, for his fellow artists, and because they spoke so beautifully and clearly and with such original emphasis. you know, that I ended up being taught him when I was a freshman at Yale in an English literature class. But that moment of artistic creation is something more than, you know, a bestseller. So George says, growing up in a painful family system, I would escape into the farmer's fields and restore my soul in the wonder of trees and rocks. That is, there's always something to be grateful for in the midst of our suffering. And the more we let ourselves experience that wonder, the more suffering we can bear if we have to, I guess. That's what I take away, George, from what you were saying. James, do you have another poem for us?
Sure. So those first two poems introduce you to the kind of the mystery of the book that the book's committed to exploring and delving into. Of course, one of the great obstacles in our day to the entering into the depths of the mystery of the church, the mystery of the soul, is the way in which so many in our age, frankly, deny and seek to destroy those things. When I was writing The River of the Immaculate Conception, I was reading Daniel Sargent's great book, Our Land and Our Lady, which is a Catholic convert's account of the settling of America. It really inspired The River of the Immaculate Conception in a number of ways. Above all, because it gives a vision of America as a Catholic land, as a Catholic country. Sargent's prose is very avuncular, very officious. It's beautiful, but it also is vulnerable in its ornamentality to being taken as a little bit too much. And it reminded me of all the wonderful things that people have decried as too much and have been torn down. And of course, I couldn't know it then, but I was at that very time writing the passages on St. Junipero Serra, and here we are a year later, where Serra's statues have been torn down as if they somehow stood in the way of some liberating ideal that's defined chiefly by its absence of any kind of form, significance, beauty, or discipline. And so I wrote this, while I was writing The River of the Immaculate Conception, I wrote this poem called An After Dinner Speech. It's on page 12 for those who want to follow along. I have to say it's my wife's favorite poem because she feels as if she spent her whole life looking for ritual and order, and it was always denied her. So she was glad to have this statement of protest, polite protest. An after dinner speech. Even now, we subject to mockery the old, officious, and avuncular postprandial toast. For can we not all see its mannered strains as dignity laid bare, its emptiness encrusted in jeweled pomp? Such are the rites on which barbarians stomp. He rises from the far head of the table, a snifter cradled near his vested paunch, cigar ash lengthening as he tells some fable from whose sententious finish he will launch on memories of an age consigned to dust, and in whose morals we no longer trust. But he will carry on undaunted, he, two nephews choking napkins in their lap, a sister glaring in her cup of tea, and wondering where he's boiled up such pap, of which it seems he has unending store, even as his deafened aunt begins to snore. We mock these things, though they've long passed away, and left no decent mores in their place, and mock, though we have nothing else to say, no fine ingathering rite or formal grace, but just an artery's solitary throb, to stand unnumbered with a raging mob.
That is amazing. And for me, it connects to all kinds of things. Maybe first of all, to the great Yeats poem, you know, the one, what is it called, in A Prayer to My Daughter?
Mm-hmm.
For my daughter, which ends with, and may her bridegroom bring her to a house where all's accustomed, ceremonious, For arrogance and hatred are the wares peddled in the thoroughfares. How but in custom and in ceremony are innocence and beauty born? Ceremony is a name for the rich horn, and custom for the spreading laurel tree. And I don't think I've always loved that. And the idea in the poem that you just read too, that you take it, it's a very postmodern classical poem, because you convey both, I don't know, you can see the cynic's view of these overwrought ceremonies while affirming that through them you can see something else. And I guess that seems to me to be deeply connected up with the question of liturgy, that in our time, too many people, what they want meaning. You can say they want feelings, but they want meaning. And they don't seem to understand that that is what liturgy gives us, precisely in ceremony, in form. It takes ordinary experience and points to next level.
It occurs to me that it was through the Irishman Edmund Burke, and then later Yeats, that I first came to be focused on form, on aesthetic form, and on ritual and on ceremony, and especially through Prayer for My Daughter, which is one of my favorite poems of all time. In fact, I have a poem called A Prayer for Livia Grace, a sestina that I wrote, one of my first published poems, that obviously borrows its title from Yeats. And the difference between Yeats, say, and Joyce, who I was just talking about earlier, is that Yeats, as a very heretical and superstitious kind of Protestant who involved himself in theosophy and the occult, he always felt as if he were standing naked and had, as it were, to invent for himself all the robes and ornament of custom and ceremony out of whole cloth, because it had been, as it were, bartered away by his ancestry. Whereas, of course, the young James Joyce could feel the weight of all of that and was trying to escape it, but also appreciated it as well. I think that's very much, this poem's probably wasn't consciously in conversation with Yeats when I was writing it, amongst other reasons, because I know Yeats had a paunch and would hold his brandy next to it. So that could have just been him.
So I'm going to go to Aidan's comment in a minute. Raising your hand, did you have something you wanted to add here?
I just would like James Matthews' thoughts on what came through to me as these kind of old rituals, ceremonies. People are bored with them. They seem antiquated. They're past their sell-by date, so to speak. But they haven't been replaced with anything. And there's an ability to see through all of that, to see meaning to it. They convey meaning to our lives, even though they might seem boring and antiquated. But kind of in the postmodern world, these things have been canceled out, but nothing has replaced them. Was this kind of along the lines we were thinking?
That's exactly right. That we have no ingathering right. The acid of modernity, the acid of cynicism, rots all away, and that knowing posture has nothing, leaves nothing left for itself, for the one who knowingly sees through all things, and for us. In fact, this really became a focus not just of this book, but of a number of poems I wrote during that period. The other poem in this, I think the next poem in the book is Revolutions, which is yet another account in a more popular verse form of this same sort of iconoclastic and ascetic tendency in our age. I think one of the challenges, and this goes to the heart of the thinking of the strangeness of the good, is that it's very easy for someone to say all these beautiful things. Well, they were beautiful, they were wonderful ornaments, and wouldn't it be nice if we could have them? But in fact, when we consider the sacramental nature of things and the liturgical nature of time and what the church imprints upon reality for us. Those things are not ornamental. They may be very beautiful, but they're the splendor of truth shining forth. And so it's not up to us to say, oh, this feels a bit antiquated, because it may in fact be a sacramental window onto the truth that can be expressed no other way.
Aiden's comment, thank you, James, for your poetry. I enjoy your rhymes and thoughts in these two very rhetorical poems. I'm interested in your connection to Joyce's Dublin, Yeats' plodding prosody. Just a second. Do you have any thoughts on Patrick Kavanagh's poems? Another blessed heretic. His poem, A View of God and the Devil, seems relevant to this forum, to what is being lamented here. There is Kavanaugh's line, he knew that posterity had no use for anything but the soul. Whole cloth poetry indeed, Aiden comments. James?
Yes, Kavanaugh was one of my early favorites. He has not endured as much in my admiration as Yeats and Joyce has, in part because first of all, he could be a bit of a deliberately sloppy craftsman, and then second, so much of his work was in fact caught up in an anti-romantic project of trying to strip away every conception of the Irish Catholic experience of its beauty. But there are moments, and I'm forgetting the exact title of the poem, forgive me, but I think it's in memory of his mother, which is one of the most beautiful of, not just of his poems, but of modern Irish poems, where he realizes fully in that poem something that he was always trying to accomplish, which was a representation of Catholic Ireland that was not a romantic imposition from the city, but in fact how someone from County Monaghan would actually have experienced it. And so the memory of passing his mother on her way to mass as she's going past the cattle gate is a really gorgeous poem. May I actually jump into the next poem there?
Can I I have one other comment.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Michael says, I can't remember the last time I ever heard anyone talk about Ivor Winters with such imagination. You must be a minority of one. Do you think Winters will ever enjoy a resurgence in popularity and recognition?
Well, not a minority of one, but I'm certainly a minority voice. I think if poetry ever recovers the place that it once occupied, and even occupied as not so long as short a time ago as 70 years ago in the United States, that Winters will inevitably enjoy a resurgence of reputation. I think he's enjoying something of that even now, actually. But he truly was one of the poets who, the great American poets who recognized the importance of both aesthetic and moral form, both to poetry and to the intellectual life. And he's a curious figure in our history. He was not an atheist, but a very weak theist. But in the 1950s, in the heyday of the neo-Thomist movement, it was not uncommon for someone to be a non-Catholic neo-Thomist, and Winters was one of them. Mortimer Adler, who later converted to Catholicism, was in the 1950s a similar case. I miss those days.
Thank you. What do you have next for us?
Well, I thought, since I was just talking about those in-gathering rites, I'd read a sonnet. It's on page 28 called The Teachers, which was written for the same magazine for which I wrote Through the Water. I think this one was on the theme of the issue was the domestic church. I don't remember now because the poem took on a life of its own. But The Teachers, a poem about the way in which the things in this world really do open up windows of truth to us. The Teachers. A father's rough hands hung with fingers laced are all the eye may ever learn of prayer. The young ear in the settling dark feels graced to hear those notes a mother's lips can spare. And every wildness of our fallen state comes crying through the child wrenched from sleep. Such wounds as by long discipline abate and leave the old man's silence calm and deep. Even the flits of time instruct the mind as it bears in and out each tempered tone. The brightening early shoot, the ripened rind, before when scoured ice can raise its moan. These figures can so make the conscience ring that speech which follows seems a poor, dumb thing.
Archbishop, you've thought a lot about fatherhood.
Yes.
A father's rough hands hung with fingers laced are all the eye may ever learn of prayer.
That's yes. How do we learn? How do we learn prayer? How do we learn to be virtuous? It's there's so many subtleties when we learn as children, right? It's we teach by example, first by example, and I think that says it all. What does it really mean to be a father? To really pray, putting that into action.
Archbishop, what are those the traditional Italian cookies that are super light wafers of it? Pizzelles?
Yeah, pizzelli. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the former pastor at my old parish, Monsignor Marino, I remember him telling the story of making pizzelles with the little pizzelle maker over the fire with his grandmother, and you would hold it over the fire for the length of a Hail Mary, and then flip it.
Yes.
Pray the Hail Mary, and this was how his spirituality was inculcated into him.
Yes. My grandmother was famous for her bread. It was unique bread, these rolls that no one was able to duplicate, but she always made the sign of the cross on the dough before she put it in the oven to make sure it would rise.
That's the kind of catechism that will be a leaven for the spiritual life.
Yeah, but it's these subtle ways that the soul is formed, right, when we're growing up.
There's a question from Chris Paolelli. There's a group of young people from Father Louis, I'm going to butcher that, I'm sorry, Querbe Scholars Program at St. Viator High School in the Chicago suburbs here with us tonight. Well, welcome to all of you young people. We're so glad and excited that you've joined us for this. Could James or the Archbishop or both, what advice do you have for young people who want to find God in art or culture, or specifically poetry, but don't know where or how to start? Maybe James, you could start us off, and then we'll finish with the Archbishop's reflection.
I think I'll have to be kind of quick. I just remember opening up a copy of Dante's Divine Comedy when I was early in my career at college, and realized that there was an entire civilization that had all but totally been concealed from me by my education. I felt as if I'd been lied to by omission. There is such a wealth of beautiful, of life-changing work that has already been written, composed, painted, sculpted, and it's out there waiting for us. And the challenge, however, is that it's as if there were an entire wall of generations standing between us and it. And so the place to look, I think, at first, really is what some people might call the usual suspects. To pick up a copy of Dante, to pick up Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey. My daughter, who's in 8th grade, is just reading Robert Fitzgerald's translation of the Odyssey in her class, and I was thrilled for a number of reasons, including that Fitzgerald was one of the great Catholic poets of the 20th century. I think the best thing to do is ask for lists. And let me say one more thing real quickly. Read the Euthyphro of Plato, because it's a very short dialogue. It's easy to understand. It's a conversation between Socrates and a man who's just returning from having had his father arrested and sentenced to death, and it's itself a great poem about questing relentlessly for the real thing, for truth, what's genuinely true, what's genuinely good, and what's genuinely beautiful, when the whole world is full of cant and charlatanry and fraudsters. You have to be willing to cut through the Euthyphros in a day like ours to arrive at anything genuinely good. And so that dialogue is a wonderful way to begin the training.
I just want to throw in a word before the Archbishop's more important reflections. We at Benedict XVI, before COVID, we edited Plato's Symposium, kind of updated a little bit. We used Jowett's translation, but took out some of the parts that are less theatrical and turned it into a parish reading group. And we did this at least 3 parishes. So and it worked really remarkably well. People would read it. We didn't have a lot of practice sessions. And then we'd all talk about it together. So it may be that among the young people here that you could get together in a small group and read aloud Euthyphro as well. And Plato really comes alive. These dialogues were not originally, I don't believe, written pieces to be read in philosophy departments. They were, well, certainly the Symposium is an account of an actual dinner party. So try that, see how it works. Archbishop, how a young artist or somebody who wants to find meaning in art, some anchors in the world, what do you recommend?
What James Matthews said really resonated with me, that sort of, if you don't mind me calling it a lament about that whole world you discovered that had been kept from you. I hear this lament over and over from Catholic young people who say they discover this whole world of beauty, and they're kind of resentful that it was kept from them. They say that, I've heard them say this literally, I've been deprived of my Catholic birthright. Mm-hmm. And it seems that our society, especially in its educational system, has suppressed this. And again, it's that idea of those what seem to be antiquated rituals that really are ways to mediate our meaning in life have been removed, but nothing has replaced it. And nothing really can replace it, because not so much that these things are old and antiquated, but there's a timelessness. There's a timeless quality about it. But this has seemingly been suppressed. And I find that when Catholic young people, anyway, I imagine others too, but when they discover this, then this whole new world of beauty has been opened up to them. One thing, when we were organizing the Benedict XVI Institute, a realization we came to was the need to support Catholic artists in their work and living their faith and bringing their values into their world of the different forms of the arts. So we seek to do that through the Institute with, we have a Catholic Arts Today, the online magazine. We're going to be having a second virtual retreat for artists coming up during Lent. But another thing I would recommend, so stay connected with their institute, but another thing I would recommend is to build upon Maggie's idea of coming together to do the reading, form a community of like-minded young Catholic artists and find a priest who understands what you're seeking and can help guide you and support you. So you form sort of a faith community of people who are committed to unlocking the world of beauty and presenting that beauty to the world in your different areas of the arts. So you need to be connected with each other, to come together regularly, but with the support of the church. So if you can find a priest also that can give you that kind of support.
Thank you, Archbishop. James, I don't want to take up all the time. I want to hear some more of your beautiful work.
Well, let's turn to the quarantine notebook. Half of the Strangeness of the Good is a long poem, or rather long series of 15 poems, each with just a date for its title, that I began writing on a whim at the same time. I'll know exactly when I began it, on March 15th of this last year, as first California and then New York, and then every place began to just shut down and go into quarantine. I was moved to write the poem because, in fact, so many of the everyday realities and the truths about reality that the sacraments teach us began to just seem like obvious, no-brainer, as it were, ways to interpret the world. By which I mean this: that every personal, private life within this quarantined house or that quarantined house, where we were implicated in each other's lives, not by any necessarily fellow feeling or sympathy, but just by the reality of it. And more than that, our private and our public lives were interweaving and rhyming with each other. One of the ways I was really moved to start this was on St. Patrick's Day, when it seemed like the leprechaun who had left candy for my kids in a leprechaun trap that morning seemed to be causing all kinds of other hijinks that were getting reported on the news, like the fellow who was hoarding all the cleaning supplies in all the states in the South in hopes of price gouging. So I wanted to share two poems from the Quarantine Notebook. My personal favorite, I have to say, is April 1st, 2020, which was the poem I wrote for my wedding anniversary. I wrote, and it's dedicated to my wife because we were married on April's Fool's Day. For what reason, I don't dare explain. But there's a recording of that that you can find on YouTube and on my website actually pretty easily. So I think I'll skip that tonight. And on page 69 is April 15th, 2020, about a month in. And here's one of those great moments. There were so many blessings and curses of quarantine. One of the blessings was that my kids, who did not know how to ride a bike before quarantine, even my oldest, by a week in, I had them all riding all over the place, and they did it continuously for the next 2 months, and it was wonderful. So here I am, April 15th, standing amidst my children as they circle around me on their bicycles. The children whirl in circles round me there, Axis and father of them all, their bikes humming against the cold air, the flash of wheels ripping about the empty parking lot outside the shuttered public library. The only person who intrudes upon their endless free procession, one old man who comes each day and plugs his laptop in with an extension cord, its long orange line led snake-like to an outlet in the stone. He sits there in his car's back seat, a door cracked to admit the power, his white head ignoring us and bent in concentration, as if pure thought turned in upon itself. But he should see how those kids whip their way, in narrow then in greater orbits flying, as do the hosts of feathered seraphim, formed rank on rank, enclosed in brilliant wings, and giving of the plenitude they circle, from greater to the lesser, so that all share in the splendor of the sourceless font, that boundless wheel of light which kindles all. Such ecstasy and glory have they found in their but recently acquired balance. They coast within a haze of radiance. Beyond us stretch the baseball fields, their backstops heavy and dull with chain-linked uselessness, the diamonds scribbled through with dirt bike tracks. And just along the margin of the wood, the playground we have named for Narnia sits idle, swings and jungle gym both wrapped in orange police tape, snapping back and forth, caught in the fitful gusts of April wind. Just out of sight, still other circles narrow. The nesting of a man into his lounger, a case of light spread open like a mouth beside the leg rest handle. On the set, an episode recorded some years back shows someone spin the wheel or shout out, "Oh." A woman, frail and shrunken in her blouse, has freshened up her tight perm with a pick, but let it drop back gently on the couch, her breath grown shallow, slowed as sleep descends. And in the early morning, fathers pace with bloodshot, angry eyes, the children yelling and crowding one another at the sink, the basins thick with aqua streaks of paste that cling beneath the cold gush jetting downward. And somewhere, someone's mother chips a nail, trying to clean the juice and crumbs that hide within the wrinkled padding of a high chair. And someone locked inside a studio whose heart is racing, racing with the boredom, reels eyes from phone to book to alley window. While in the paper, blotches pullulate and overlap upon a printed map, like an old stack of tiddlywinks we've scattered. Our dogwoods now stand prim with pinkish flowers, the maple in the side yard bulging clusters, while apple and magnolia shed last petals in skirts that radiate about their trunks. Yet even now, the season's gripped with chill, and I find twisting on the air, a few stray flurries wend their pointless journey down, as if to warn us all that comes to pass will be turned back upon itself in time, however much time seems one long straight line. And in this spiraling about Naxos, we may see fate, but fate has its own order, and order brings with it a kind of freedom, as Thomas proves when he repeats each arc about the lot as if it were the cosmos, that place of churning planets, winding stars, and singing angels covering their eyes, his cycle racing wild and spinning pageant so fast I hardly note the trepidations.
I just love that. I just love that. One line just leaps out at me among many. And order brings with it a kind of freedom. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yes. So, there's so much to say. The most perfect vision of what the world looks like through Catholic eyes is it can be found in book 4 of the Pseudo-Dionysiuses, The Divine Names, where he describes all things being brought into being from non-being out of desire for God, and God himself moving out in ecstasy to things. This is the origin, it's the anticipation of the origin of the word hierarchy, which Pseudo-Dionysius coined. The idea of a hierarchy, not as so many people now conceive it, as a unequal distribution of power or a chain of ascending power. Hierarchy for Pseudo-Dionysius was the way in which, from the greater down to the lesser, the goodness of God flows forth, with the greater reaching down to help the lesser, and the lesser yearning up in desire to rise to what's above it. This is how the world actually looks. And it was so beautiful that one April day to look at my kids circling around and hearing, I sing, one of the hymns I sing to my kids a lot is Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. And the rank on rank, the hosts of heaven descending with the light of lights. And then the seraphim and the cherubim with their eyes covered by their wings as they circle around God. I just realized, I'm experiencing a symbol of this right now. That's all I have.
There's a lot in there. Again, welcome anyone who wants to comment. I wanted to go back a minute, just if you'll forgive me, but you mentioned that I'm putting words in your mouth here, so they may not be exactly right, but your sense of symbol. We were talking about liturgy, and that's why I was surprised when you went there. Edmund Burke, I assumed you were talking about Reflections, the famous passage from Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he talks about what happens. A queen will just become a woman, right? It's like a creeping empiricism. But I also find these oddly reassuring to remember maybe because I was born in 1960, which was on the cusp of, my parents are part of the greatest generation. We had emerged from their terrible trials in the Great Depression and World War II to a period of relative prosperity, which, has then tumultuously morphed into many different things, better for some people, but a sense of continuous liquid modernity, fusing through. Just when you think you've integrated something new, just when you get gay marriage, just when you begin to think that we're going to be able to focus on how children need a mom and a dad, then the claims of gay marriage come rolling through. And then right after that, the idea that that people's gender is not something given to them in their bodies. It's something that can be different in your mind than in your body. And that's just part of my personal roller coaster. There's been a thousand others you can name. So I'm just, and it's reassuring to remember that we imagine the past as being, more orderly than it was. In fact, it's been quite tumultuous, and through it, art has been made, intellectual advances have been made. The church faces like a wave, like the revolution in France, when priests are executed willy-nilly, and yet the church is still here and beauty still calls us. So that was I'm sorry I talked too much, but this idea of getting from Edmund, what did you get from Edmund Burke that in terms of symbol?
Oh, I've gotten so much from Burke. I have to mention in my first book of poems, Some Permanent Things. That book is composed of 4 long poetic sequences, the longest of which is called 4 verse letters. And in 4 verse letters, I actually took the passage that you're referring to from the Marie Antoinette speech from Burke, and I put it into rhymed iambic pentameters. I've so loved that speech for so long. I wanted it to be part of my poetry, so I put it into pentameters for the purpose of that poem. It's a scene where I'm giving a lecture on Edmund Burke down at a public school in North Carolina. But I did start talking about symbol instead of liturgy, but obviously what Pseudo Dionysius is giving us there is the great pageant or liturgy of the cosmos, of which our church architecture and of which the Mass is a particular expression. So it really is, even though my comments were more addressing symbol, it was liturgy that I think was lying at the heart of this poem.
There's some complex relationship between, I don't know, there's the famous Flannery O'Connor that if the Eucharist is just a symbol, forget about it. But there's also, which is true, to hell with it is what she actually said. There are signs or maps which are less than the thing that they represent. So like a map is useful because it's not a forest. It shows you how to get from place A to B by stripping a lot of the information and reality out. So it's instrumentally incredibly useful, but it's less than the thing it represents. A symbol is actually more than the thing it represents, right? A flag gives us access into the sense that we are a nation and not just a bunch of unrelated individuals. But in itself, it's just a piece of cloth, right? So there's a sort of a quasi-sacramental nature of symbols in themselves that are, and you spoke about the poignancy of Yeats feeling he had to create this all for himself, but they become powerful because they're shared and they're built on communally over time. I don't want to, Tamara, who's a really fine poet, wanted to tell you that she really loves the language of the April 15th poem. It has such momentum. The rhythm and the movement in it mirrors the description you just spoke about the host of the angels and the hymn you mentioned singing them.
How would I put it? I'm a pretty pedantic poet for in terms of my joy in writing, the experience of pleasure, the experience of joy comes primarily in putting iams together. And when it came to the quarantine notebook, which are all in blank verse, so there are a few rhymes in the poem as a whole, but there's virtually none. Mostly the poem's content is where the rhymes are. My concern was to attain a kind of speech for iambic pentameter that I hadn't achieved before. One of which was to really focus on the rhythms of the lines as lines, so I was hoping for just that response, Tamara. Thank you.
Let's go to the next poem. We have a few more comments, but I want to make sure we get the poems in, and then we'll go to the comments.
I think this will probably be the last one I read for you tonight. There's so many I'd like to share, but this one, first of all, it begins with California, and so I had to make some kind of reference to California, where I would look forward to visiting with you all again someday when these sorts of events are in the past. But also, I thought it might be salient for what we've just been talking about is a symbol, just a symbol. In this section of the poem, I mentioned a conversation I had with students and with others about the nature of beauty. Because of course, a romantic or a very modern way of thinking of beauty would be to locate it in the subject as something that, as it were, we aesthetically judge in here about what's out there. So the beauty ends up being in here. And this, of course, has always seemed to me like a deeply impoverished way to understand reality, that beauty is what Thomas Aquinas called a property of being. It inheres in being. So just as everything insofar as it is true, what else could it be? And everything is good, everything is the object of an intention and desirable. Everything insofar as it is beautiful. And I think it's learning to, as it were, get over ourselves and to set aside our obsession with assigning everything to our subjectivity, that we finally actually open ourselves up to the mystery of being, to the mystery of the world. This is also a nice poem in a sense with which to conclude, because it returns to this question of enchantment and the way in which those childhood experiences of the everyday lure us into reality. Just for those of you who don't know, which I think would be most of you, I have 5 children, and they all make their appearances at different times in the quarantine notebook. So this is a poem late in the sequence. So just so you know, so Thomas is 7 at this time, and his younger sister Cece is 5. April 30th, 2020. Last weekend, summer came to California. So all the cooped up, sheltering in place, and withering to paleness citizens invaded beaches up and down the coast. A girl in her bikini ran through spray, its iridescence veiling soft live legs that stretched and leapt above the silvered sand. Her hair slicked back and trailing in dark cords, her body given to the wind's caress. News cameras beamed her form around the world to show us freedom is voluptuous. This morning, though, she's locked indoors again. We saw her briefly on TV before the winds here, raging through our towering oaks and sloshing maples like drenched heavy mop heads, knocked down a power line and cut her out. I look up at the clouds, their ominous convoy that blots out all the sky, and know the world is angry and has other plans for us. Though like a houseless leer, I may not name them. Cecilia overheard some other news. A company has turned our firemen, our doctors, cops, and nurses into dolls. Or anyway, that's how the broadcast phrased it. She sees them staring right out from the screen, those plastic eyes and smiles fixed for good. How did they turn them into that, she asked. Magic, I said. And magic I say now, writing this in the glare of glowering sky. But Thomas steps right in. There's no such thing, he says, with all the urgency of one for whom the question's very much alive. I'm sorry, I reply. Then how would you explain how people were transformed to dolls? It's as I thought. He has no better theory. but his round freckled face is firmly set, the dimples deepening into doubting dogma, and stubborn for a fact he thinks he knows. Just yesterday, I had a conversation about the place of meaning in a book, not what the meaning was, but where it is. The young man I was talking with insisted, a bit like Thomas, that it's in our heads, not in the book at all. He mentioned Gödel, and after that, I couldn't really follow. It seems so much a thick and shaggy nonsense. We raised the question of the waterfall, the same old problem Kant and Goethe mold, when men still looked with patience at the world and saw its urgent metamorphoses and wondered was it stranger or a friend, a womb of symbols or a canvas for them. The waterfall is beautiful, we say. But are we speaking of the waterfall or what the waterfall has made us feel? Such nonsense as the young will sometimes speak to make themselves feel hardened into age. But I stare up at clouds like great gray hosts, abroad to conquer everything they see. I hear the wind set strong, broad shoulders low, and ram against our helpless house's side, and do not speak, but wait within its powers. I wait and live again in thought just now. The other day, I bent with naked chest and leaned my lowered head above the sink. My wife stood over with a pair of clippers. She touched the shagging gray about my sides, the stiff hairs curling over ear and nape, and raised them slowly, patiently. Her hand gentle and firm to keep the head in place, that locust given too much weight by others, but humble and receptive to her palm. And down into the silver drain, the dull hairs sheared in squads of iron tuft, and lay, absorbing droplets from the nozzle, until my crown was light and clear again, and I rose up, that my still lively face might turn receptive eyes once more upon the gowned and gleaming symbols of the world.
Thank you, James. Let me look and see. I know there were a few comments. I see that Lori Parle is saying that her mother, who is with us and enjoying every world, actually sees the cherubim and the seraphim. If you have time to stay, Lori, we'd love to hear about that experience. Aiden says, what I like best in your poems, sorry, every time someone puts a new one, it goes, is recognizing the poets and philosophers we share as masters, as almost friends. I want to riff on that a minute, James, and go back to our young people who are asking how to get involved in this world of experiencing the divine in art. And you gave some great advice. But, you know, the tradition is great and rich, and the conversation really important with the dead as well as with the living. But what is so remarkable, and what this comment is putting on, is that when you read The Strangeness of the Good, we're in conversation with you, in conversation with this tradition. So just by that very act, we're experiencing it not as a dead tradition, but as something that is illuminating our lives and is also producing a new generation of artists in conversation with it. So, I really want to urge the young people that the problem with the greatness of our tradition is that it shouldn't be an intimidation to new creation, right? The point, it's not a contest in which your worth has no value unless it's the best that has ever been written in time and history, but that art gives us a window into experiencing who we are and what the world really is. And from that, there can come new fruits of various kinds.
For my part, it's the joy of writing poems has always been feeling as if I were entering into a tradition, participating in it and speaking to others within it. The image of happiness not perfect happiness for me, but the image of a certain kind of intellectual fulfillment for me is to mention Dante again, that moment in the 5th canto of the Inferno, when he walks with Virgil into the Elysian fields and sees, I think by a rock, the company of the poets, Homer, Horace, Terence, and others, and they welcome him into their company. And he makes a point, Dante, who was not exactly the most modest of men, that he was 6th among them. So that means he's the 6th greatest poet of all time. But leave that part aside. Maybe a better moment is just a little bit later. Well, at the end of the Purgatorio, right before Dante goes to see his Beatrice and with her flies up to heaven to see God himself. In the last bit of walking before he sees Beatrice, he follows along behind Virgil and Virgil's contemporary, the Roman poet Statius, who are busy in conversation, and Dante follows along listening to them talk about the nature of poetry. And that's definitely how I feel when I'm writing. I'm following along behind those who have come before me in hopes to hear what they have said, because so much of what they have to say, of course, has fulfilled me. And it's only in speaking back to them that in the act of speaking back to him, that's how new poems come into being.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. We have hit our hour-and-a-half mark. As I said, I will stay around. I don't know how much time James or the Archbishop have, but I would love to get to know you more and to hear what's happening in your world in this time of COVID. And we're so fortunate. Oh, first I have to hold up this book again, The Strangeness of the Good, which you can get from Amazon.com. And it's something I've started actually, James also recommended another, I don't know, I was reading him, Charles Mackay, who is a Black American convert, late convert to Catholicism. And I'd never heard of him really. I mean, don't be intimidated by all the things you don't know. That means there's a lot of great things that even when you're as old as I am, you'll learn that maybe you should have learned, but it's something new. And I just keep those poems by my table, and I just try to read when I have a tea break. I just try to read one of them and experience it. So build places for beauty into your life is my recommendation. And one of the most beautiful moments is a blessing from the Archbishop. So Archbishop.
Good. Well, thank you, Maggie. And thank you for a moment ago ending on the point about rediscovering this tradition doesn't cut off future works of art. It inspires, on the contrary, inspires future works of art when they're in continuity with the tradition. That's how we continue to give glory to God. And as you're fond of saying, the greatest works of art are yet to come. So let us ask God's blessing upon us as we give him glory. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And may the blessed Almighty God come upon you and remain with you forever, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.